Since biblical times, the Jewish nation has been defined by its journeys. As a traveling people, we've carried our faith with us across borders and seas, as a sign upon our hands and a memorial between our eyes. And when we arrived in strange lands, we found a sense of home in the Jewish communities we established. The struggle to strike a balance between tradition and change has underscored the story of our countless Jewish communities around the world, and it is ever present in the living history of our own congregation at Beth Israel in Bangor, Maine. This is the story of our community at Congregation Beth Israel. This is the story of 120 years of our history, recounted by the people who lived it. The little shtetls of Eastern Europe are the true birthplaces of our congregation. It was there, in the lands that now comprise Russia, Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, and Estonia, that Ashkenazi culture took root and flourished. Our story begins in these Eastern European villages, where the forefathers of Congregation Beth Israel were born. The first men and women of our synagogue lived through difficult times, yet the strong community structure, with traditional Jewish religion at its core, was a force that brought comfort and vibrancy to a cold and unforgiving environment. The pogroms of the 1880s strained shtetl life to the breaking point, as Jews were beaten, killed, and forced to obey a series of cruel mandates after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. Thousands of Eastern European Jews decided to leave their homes and emigrate to America. Most of the first members of Congregation Beth Israel passed through Ellis Island in New York, welcomed in by the encouraging gaze of Lady Liberty.
So my grandmother told me a few stories about how she was afraid of the Russians, the Bolsheviks. I can't even remember what she called them, but it wasn't very nice. They were afraid of them, and she saw a member of her family killed. And they didn't live in a house, they lived in like a hut, a tent. So they were really poor. I don't know how they managed to get here, except that when they got here, in both cases, my grandparents on both sides, there was a family member that put up the $50 for each one of them so they could get off of Ellis Island. When they got off of Ellis Island, they just about directly came to Bangor because the person that sponsored them lived in Bangor.
By the 1870s and 1880s, New York and the surrounding areas were rather saturated with Jewish immigrants, and so the founders headed northeast. Jewish immigrants came to Bangor in three main waves: German, Lithuanian, and Russian. The first Jews to settle in Bangor were of German origin. They sought to establish a Jewish cemetery and butcher shop, and formed an association called Achavas Achim, which conducted the very first minyan in Bangor in 1849. German Jews did not see religious ritual as being inseparable from day-to-day living, and were less likely to consider themselves fundamentally different from their Gentile neighbors.
The German Jews were educated, assimilated, went into business. The Eastern European Jews wore beards and skull caps, and their only education was Jewish education, and the two communities never mingled.
By the end of the century, most of the first Jewish immigrants had converted to Christianity or intermarried. The second period of Jewish immigration occurred during the 1860s and 70s with the arrival of Lithuanian Jews, or Litvaks as they called themselves. Devout Ashkenazi Jews who spoke Yiddish and thought it the language of all Jews the world over, the Litvaks were shocked to find that the German Jews in Bangor did not understand their words or their customs. The third and largest group of Jews to come to Bangor was comprised of Russian and Polish men and women who fled the oppression of the pogroms. To the relief of the Litvaks, these Russische Jews considered Yiddish to be their native language, yet there were slight differences in their prayers and rituals that strained relations between the two groups. While the rest of New England was already being swept up in the excitement of the Industrial Revolution, Maine maintained its rural lifestyle and Yankee sensibilities.
My grandmother and grandfather ended up in Bangor, Maine, because my grandfather was a lumberman in Russia, and they told him that there was a lot of lumber in Maine, and he could get a job up there, because originally they didn't have any relatives or family that could take them in, and they had to find a job after they got to the States.
Bangor was one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the Northeast because of its booming lumber industry. Giant logs bobbed down the icy waters of the Penobscot River as steamboats belched clouds of smoke and carriages drove over pine-covered hills. At the time, Bangor was the gateway to the wilderness to the north, and Jewish immigrants came here to sell provisions to the farmers and woodsmen who were living in remote areas.
And my dad didn't have any occupation. He was a scholar, Jewish, a very observing Jew. And he started peddling because he couldn't work for anybody, that nobody would hire a Jew that wouldn't work on Saturday to begin with, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism in those days too. So most of them started out peddling. And he got a horse and a wagon. He'd go out in the country and buy odd things, pieces of furniture, clothing, books, anything he thought he could sell, and come back to Bangor.
In spite of the tension between the Lithuanian and Russian immigrants, Jewish folks who had already established themselves in town engaged in many noble efforts to assist the new arrivals in adjusting to life in America. The Independent Order of the Sons of Benjamin was the first Jewish aid organization in Maine. It was initially founded with the purpose of maintaining a sanctified burial ground for the Jewish community of Bangor. To establish and keep up a legitimate cemetery for their dead was the highest priority of the new community, so the order purchased a plot of land for $45 and organized the Chevra Kadisha, which made sure that every person would be properly cared for and buried after their death. It was considered a great honor and sign of righteousness to belong to this burial society. After the first vital task of establishing a suitable cemetery was accomplished, the Independent Order of the Sons of Benjamin continued its mitzvot by helping penniless Jewish immigrants.
There was a fund in this synagogue, as there was in most, where a man who had nothing came in and borrowed $10 and maybe got a cartload of merchandise and peddled it. And then they'd come back and pay the $10 back, or pay 3 of it back, or whatever it was.
The organization gathered funds from within the Jewish community and then loaned them to new arrivals so that they might buy the first supplies necessary to head into the woods and begin peddling.
It was difficult. You would get up Monday morning and harness a horse and wagon and take a loaf of bread with him and stop at the farm, see what they had to sell, and he would have his meals at the farmhouses, and all he would have would be milk and eggs and the bread that he had with him. He was still very observant about his diet, about his food. And he came back Thursday, and then we would be, Friday we'd be preparing for the Shabbos. So he would do whatever other chores he had to do around the house.
In 1882, Ezriel Lemke Allen, the first founder of Congregation Beth Israel, arrived in Bangor. He, Ike Wolper, Jacob Altman, Harry Cohen, Israel Goldman, Joe Beyer, Joe Bernstein, Marks Goldman, Philip Hilson, and Simon Kaminsky constituted the minyan that would later grow to be Congregation Beth Israel. These men banded together to uphold their Jewish traditions, and although they had neither a rabbi nor a cantor, they held services in their humble apartments and became associates and friends. In October 1888, the bonds that held that loose association together were cemented when a group of young men convened in Lemke Allen's home to formally create the Beth Israel Society. At the meeting, the men selected leaders and set membership dues to pay for the rent of a small hall where services would be conducted. The issue of securing a Sefer Torah was paramount in the minds of the founders. It was decided that they would borrow a Sefer Torah from the Ohabai Shalom congregation in Boston until the Jews in Bangor were capable of purchasing their own in 1889. And so, with those matters settled, our forefathers strode confidently onward, clearing a path for the future of Bangor Jewry. In 1897, after 9 years of conducting services in a cramped rented space on Park Street, the founders concluded that it was time to build a synagogue worthy of the growing Jewish community of Bangor, Maine. The board of directors concluded that they would officially establish a congregation to be known and distinguished by the name of Congregation Beth Israel in the city of Bangor. In spite of the relative scarcity of funds, the board of directors managed to raise $2,500. Even that sum was not sufficient to cover all of the costs. The directors successfully petitioned a wealthy Jewish philanthropist, Jacob Schiff, for a donation toward the synagogue's construction. With the money raised, the builders broke ground on the west side of Center Street in Bangor. The first Beth Israel synagogue was a sturdy, almost square house with whitewashed wooden siding. The importance of following religious custom prevailed over design, hence the building was small and plain. That same year, the congregation's first Talmud Torah school was established, which marked the beginning of formal Jewish education in Bangor. In 1903, the congregation was able to hire its first spiritual leader, Rabbi Louis Seltzer, a Polish-born scholar who provided great leadership to the Jews of Bangor. As another sign of the congregation's growth, in 1907 Beth Israel formally purchased a tract of burial ground in the Mount Hope Cemetery and bought the Jewish section of the Webster Avenue Cemetery from the Independent Order of the Sons of Benjamin. The Hever Kadisha, which was previously run by the Independent Order of the Sons of Benjamin, was transferred to the management of the synagogue. The 100 members of Beth Israel communed in prayer in their first chapel every day for 14 years, until the winds brought disaster to our city. On April 30th, 1911, a fire broke out in the hayshed of J. Frank Green on Broad Street, and the strong breeze carried the sparks from the barn to adjacent homes, which in turn spread the fire to other nearby buildings, creating an uncontrollable blaze that was to consume nearly the entire city. Tom Gibbons and Adolf Friedman valiantly entered the burning synagogue through a window. An explosion occurred, and the building caved in, nearly trapping both men in the rubble. Gibbons and Friedman emerged from the synagogue, coughing and covered with soot, carrying the Sifrei Torah and a few other holy books to safety. For Beth Israel's congregants, the loss of their spiritual home was heartbreaking, yet our first members had survived great hardship and had faith that they could begin again. The leaders of our synagogue wasted no time in hastening to rebuild the sanctuary. The congregation approved plans for a new building by June 26, 1911, only months after the Great Fire consumed most of the city. In less than 2 years, the synagogue on York Street was complete. The dedication ceremony for the new sanctuary was held on March 9, 1913, and the pews were filled with Jews and Gentiles alike, from as near as York Street and as far as New York City. The shul was being rebuilt in more ways than one. The congregation redrafted their constitution and elected a board of directors to lead Beth Israel into a new era. 20 men were to raise Beth Israel from the ashes, led by the new president, Abraham Burson. Growing in membership and activity, the congregants of Beth Israel were optimistic about the future of their community. In 1912, they hired Rabbi Moshe Shochet, who would emerge as one of the leading members of the Maine rabbinate. Described as a tireless defender of traditional Judaism, he advocated for more rights for Jewish immigrants and emphasized the importance of observing Jewish law. Rabbi Shochet set regulations for kashrut with Jewish butchers and revived popular interest in Jewish learning. World War I brought nationalism, activism, and devastation. The Jewish Legion was a military organization that rallied Jewish people to fight in World War I. A train full of Jewish Legion soldiers and recruiters passed through Bangor during the war. One of the men on that train, David Ben-Gurion, later became the first prime minister of Israel.
They recruited these people, and my father found out that there was a train load coming from somewhere, probably the New York area, I don't know, and they were on their way to Halifax. It was very common for people to go to Halifax to pick up boats because train travel could be more pleasant sometimes than troop ships and other things. So Halifax was a major port. He heard they were coming through, so he just simply organized the local community, and I think they rented rooms on State Street someplace, and they made sandwiches and hired a band, and they all marched down at 1 or 2 in the morning, and when the train came in, they got the band to play, and the train was going to stop for a half an hour or so. The people on the train did not know this was coming, and according to the stories I've seen, there was dancing and sandwiches and food, and everyone had a great time, and one of the men on the train happened to be Ben-Gurion. And there are books written on the history of the Jewish Legion, and in most of them that incident apparently appealed enough to the people on the train that they've written about it. And then Ben-Gurion in around 1950 made a speech somewhere in which I had read, and he referred to it.
After the war broke out, several members of our community volunteered to serve their country. 2 young men from Beth Israel, Hyman Hilson and Henry Late, were killed in action. As a witness to the horrors of the Russian pogroms, Meyer Minsky was passionate about the dream of founding a homeland for the Jewish people.
I think he thought Jews had to have a homeland. I mean, he had experienced what was going on in Europe. It was long a dream, both religiously. If you look at the Siddur, you'll see the return to Zion constantly, the reference to Jerusalem constantly, plus the life they had in Russia. They knew they had to, they knew nothing. What the experience in the United States is a probably unique one, but if you study, you can almost not find a country in Europe at one time where the Jews were not expelled. So that the idea of a place of their own where they'd be their own masters was to people in those days a pipe dream, but some had the dream.
He was a principled man who felt a strong desire to organize and to serve, and so he founded a Bangor chapter of the Labor Zionist movement, and then the Sons and Daughters of Zion, a mostly social organization for the Jewish community. In 1925, the Jewish community became a sort of federation, as Beth Abraham and Beth Israel both shared the new religious leader, Rabbi Eliezer Levine. He was nearly successful in uniting the 2 congregations.
And I remember him giving sermons from the pulpit, and it was not done in a strictly narrative manner. He chanted his sermons in a minor key and paced back and forth across the pulpit, so that within minutes, all the ladies had their white handkerchiefs out and dabbing away the tears. At the end of each sermon, the ladies would say, "What a wonderful sermon. I cried so much." But that was the way he did it. It was chanted in an old European manner. I haven't seen it since, but it was very moving and very touching, very effective.
During the 20s and 30s, a lively new generation of Jews in Bangor was raised. The children of Polish and Russian immigrants, these first-generation Americans attended public school and played baseball in the courtyard with their Irish neighbors, while they were instructed in the ways of Orthodox Judaism. They spoke Yiddish at home and English at school. These young Jews were able to harmonize their Jewish upbringing with their American surroundings, yet they faced anti-Semitism.
We were riding on the city bus. I had been out of school for a couple days for some Jewish holiday. I can't remember which one it was. And there was this boy, Dickie Green, on the bus who was very jealous because I was out of school and he wasn't. And he started calling me a dirty Jew and what right did I have not to be in school. And he said to this boy next to him, Willie Schubert, "Willie, isn't she a dirty Jew?" And Willie turned around and said, "I don't know, Dickie, I'm half Jewish." And he was, and they lived 2 houses away from me. Their father was Jewish. And so Dickie didn't say another word, but it hurt. It hurt.
Jews responded to prejudice not by returning hate with hate, but by joining together, forming Jewish clubs when barred from Christian organizations. The most prominent of these social organizations was the Jewish Community Center, which opened in 1938. The center was exactly that, the focal point of Jewish social, cultural, and educational life in Bangor. Meanwhile, Jewish businesses were thriving in Bangor despite the Great Depression. By the 1930s, most of the Jewish peddlers had earned enough money to invest in opening factories or stores. Financial success meant more contact with non-Jewish entrepreneurs and professionals, and thus easier access into Gentile social circles. The Jewish community was integrating with their Christian neighbors, but barriers still remained. The situation in Europe was again escalating, and the Second World War broke out in 1939. Many members of our congregation served in the armed forces during the war, fulfilling their duty to the United States as well as to the Jewish people. Back at home, those who were not in the military aided the war effort by organizing fundraisers and rationing their food. As news spread of the horrors of the Holocaust, the Zionist cause was reinvigorated. Many of the young men of Congregation Beth Israel who had fought in the war returned to Bangor. They worked in their family businesses or started up their own enterprises. The hearts of the Jewish community worldwide were stricken by the incomprehensible tragedy of the Holocaust, but our people had hope that a new day would dawn. Israel achieved statehood in 1948, a culmination of the Zionist dream, and American Jews were grateful for the freedom to live and worship as they chose. After World War II, it seemed that everything had changed, and from 1945 to 1950, Beth Israel experienced a transformation of leadership and ritual. The orthodoxy of the founding members clashed with the conservative leanings of the second generation. In 1948, after much disagreement, the board ruled in favor of mixed family seating. Women were able to come down from the balcony and sit with their husbands and sons, a move that symbolized a concerted effort to modernize our practices and take a step toward conservative Judaism. To increase seating, the bima was moved from the center of the sanctuary to the back wall. In the midst of this shift in customs, Rabbi Avraham Friedman assumed the post of rabbi in 1949.
He was a very dignified, principled rabbi. He was an Orthodox rabbi, tall in stature with a little mustache. And everything he did was heartfelt for the shul, for the benefit of the shul. I don't ever recall him doing anything for his own benefit.
Without question, Rabbi Friedman was one of the most influential rabbis to serve our congregation thus far. Rabbi Friedman was a great communicator and an inspirational speaker who had a passion for educating congregants of all ages. He effectively welcomed in new members, and during his term as rabbi, our congregation grew to an unprecedented 300 families. With such a charismatic spiritual leader at the helm, new administrative leadership came forward to run the board of directors. Harold Epstein and Samuel Ralsky were the two-man team that led the congregation into its most prosperous era.
And not only were they friends, but they were very, very interested, both of them, in the synagogue. And so they were like a two-man team. If something needed to be done in this synagogue, they did the fundraising. They went out and found people that were willing to donate and do things. If they needed a rabbi, they were involved. Whatever was involved in this synagogue, that was what Sam and he did together.
The leaders of our synagogue, who often worked behind the scenes to keep things running smoothly, were the women of the shul. The sisterhood was officially formed in 1949, with Bess Minsky as its first president, and it has continued to be a pillar of the shul, organizing social and fundraising events. During this time period, the majority of the ladies of our congregation were not working outside the home, and devoted a significant portion of their time to local Jewish organizations.
The women at that time were very, very active in the synagogue and in the sisterhood, helping as a helping hand to maintain and run the synagogue as everyone would want it to be. And it did run smoothly, and it was a great deal of pride to all of us.
The Jewish Community Center reached its height during the 1960s.
The Jewish Community Center definitely was the focal point of my growing up as a young Jewish girl, and we had a wonderful time there. And we contributed a lot to the community as a whole. We had fundraisers that helped different organizations in the city of Bangor.
Its many social and educational events included children's fashion shows, theater productions, dances, and a highly successful art show. The center had a cohesive effect on the Jewish community, for it engaged members of all synagogues in fun activities. In 1969, Rabbi Friedman announced his decision to leave Beth Israel and move to Israel. After 20 years of his wise counsel and spiritual direction, Congregation Beth Israel was suddenly forced to replace its beloved rabbi. And as one era ended, a new chapter in Beth Israel's history began. With every drastic change, there is opportunity for growth, and Beth Israel wanted to continue Rabbi Friedman's legacy while stepping into a new phase. Congregation Beth Israel had been gradually moving away from Orthodox Judaism. As a recent graduate of Yeshiva University in New York, Rabbi Alan Kalinsky assumed the pulpit in 1976. Rabbi Kalinsky was, like all previous rabbis to lead our synagogue, educated in the Orthodox tradition, but he supported the expanded role of women in Judaism. Many members were clamoring for a more modern, inclusive service. A week after the synagogue celebrated Rabbi Kalinsky's arrival, the board of directors voted to join the conservative movement. To correspond with the theological changes happening at the time, the synagogue building was remodeled. As part of an extensive renovation project, the roof and exterior walls were repaired, and new ornamental features were added to the sanctuary's interior. The sisterhood played a substantial part in the remodeling process, as they raised all the funds needed to completely refurbish the kitchen. The kitchen has always been a hub of the synagogue, especially for the sisterhood, and we've been blessed with the commitment and delicious food of numerous kitchen volunteers. Sadie Scher and her daughter, Frida Miller, catered functions at the synagogue and Jewish Community Center with their divine Jewish food. They worked in the kitchen with Celia Siegel, a Holocaust survivor and one of the most beloved members of our synagogue. Mrs. Siegel trained other volunteers to prepare the Sabbath and holiday meals in the proper kosher tradition, and her kugel was beyond compare.
It's important to maintain a kosher kitchen and to maintain it as a role model. If the youth have questions about having a kosher kitchen or about koshering, and to have the kosher kitchen for the members.
In 1981, Rabbi Kalinsky left his post as rabbi, and the following year, Rabbi Joseph Schonberger became Beth Israel's first conservative rabbi. Rabbi Schonberger wanted to augment participation in Jewish activities at the synagogue, so he revitalized programming for all ages. His wife, Susan Schonberger, was a tremendous volunteer and a dedicated Hebrew school teacher.
Joseph continued to help this congregation find its identity as a conservative synagogue. He was very young at the time that he came, and very much unlike Alan, who was an Orthodox rabbi in a conservative shul. Joseph was a conservative rabbi in a conservative shul. So I think he helped us move ourselves along and helped us work with United Synagogue in terms of finding our place.
Congregation Beth Israel was steadily transitioning into the conservative movement. At a board meeting in June 1985, the board passed a motion that would allow women to go up on the bima and open the ark with their husbands. In 1987, the board voted to allow women to take aliyot, also with their husbands, which was a sign of progress toward egalitarianism. Amidst all these changes, Congregation Beth Israel made sure to honor its past. The synagogue celebrated its 100th anniversary in 1988. Norman Minsky thought it important to keep the momentum of the centennial celebration going in order to ensure another 100 years at Congregation Beth Israel. Several members of our congregation saw financial trouble on the horizon for our synagogue, since the demographics of the membership were changing. Minsky and the board decided to establish an endowment fund for Beth Israel, as well as an annual appeal to be held on Yom Kippur.
I have always had very, very strong feelings, not just as to the synagogue, but all of the organizations, Jewish or otherwise, that the demographics of Bangor are changing. We don't have Main Street merchants, we don't have manufacturers, that if organizations were going to exist, they're going to have endowments. And I had an opportunity in 1987, 1988, with the 100th anniversary of the synagogue, to start an endowment.
Building for the future meant more to Beth Israel than the establishment of the Second Century Fund. The congregation approved plans to build a 4,000 square foot addition to the sanctuary in 1989. Sidney and Helen Epstein generously donated the money needed to construct the foyer and social hall with a beautiful ceiling imprinted with Stars of David. As time progressed, more congregants expressed a desire to include women in the services. In 1990, women were counted in the minyan for the first time, and in 1996, the congregation voted to allow women to be called to the Torah and read from it.
The complete involvement of women, that is counting women in the minyan, in the minyanim, and also having women have full rights to come to for an aliyah on the bima, only happened after '96. And that changed the whole, I think, the whole color of the synagogue, because without the women and their involvement, the synagogue would be a very different kind of place today.
Decades of debate finally concluded as Beth Israel proudly became fully egalitarian. After 15 years at the pulpit, Rabbi Schonberger resigned and moved to Ohio in 1997. This departure marked the end of a time of great change and progress. In our history, periods between rabbis have certainly never been easy for the congregation. However, during the 2 years after Rabbi Schonberger's departure, the combination of leadership by gabbis, interim spiritual leaders, and congregants proved to be an important evolution for Beth Israel. After a congregational retreat and subsequent meetings, our congregation realized the need for renewed spirit and energy as we moved forward. Accordingly, Beth Israel made a concerted effort to ensure that families, children, mixed marriage couples, and visitors felt welcome and valued in our community. Many rabbis and presidents began this effort in previous years, and many volunteers during Bernie Kubitz's presidency worked to implement it. And the results showed. We experienced a surge in energy, optimism, and membership. Despite the absence of a rabbi, Beth Israel continued to provide quality education, programming, and meaningful religious services to its congregants. Volunteerism at Beth Israel was at an all-time high. Rabbi Rod Bretler accepted the position of rabbi in 1999 after his graduation from the Jewish Theological Seminary. While he brought great energy to the pulpit, Rabbi Bretler ultimately decided the rabbinate was not for him and left Beth Israel within 18 months. During his term, however, education and programming continued to improve. Rabbi David Cantor, a graduate of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, accepted the position in 2001. Rabbi Cantor and his young family were embraced by the congregation. He built a close relationship with the rabbis of the Orthodox and Reform synagogues in Bangor, and the rabbis regularly studied together.
Rabbi Cantor was able to connect with the religious life of Bangor. He became a well-known figure on radio, in the newspapers. He would write articles. He was a wonderful speaker.
Rabbi Cantor left our congregation in 2007 to take a pulpit in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Over the past year, as we searched for a new rabbi, the volunteering spirit of our synagogue was rejuvenated. Many devoted congregants stepped up in this time of need to lead services, read Torah, and plan social and educational activities. In 2008, we welcomed Rabbi Stephen Schwartzman into our congregation, and we're all so pleased to have him and his family here with us.
This is a congregation that goes back 120 years, which is no small accomplishment. And it is a congregation that is the same congregation going back 120 years, with evolution over time, religiously and otherwise. But you can see names on the plaques on the walls that are still borne by people today who are members. And that says something. It is not just the same congregation by name, it's the same congregation inherently, essentially. And yet, it's not identical to how it was 120 years ago, nor is it identical to how it will be in another 120 years. So the ways that I see that this congregation is going to be growing include a renewed commitment to making the service meaningful, to observance, to participation, and learning.
The future of our congregation lies in the hands of our youth.
I've grown up being Jewish. I mean, I've always been in this synagogue, and my grandmother and my grandfather were Jewish. And we've celebrated holidays and traditions, and it's just been so much fun and so wonderful. And it's so important to me to just continue that.
We have high hopes for Beth Israel, and thanks to the contributions of members throughout the past 120 years, we are confident these hopes will become a reality. Our journey as a congregation has taken us from 19th century Russia to modern-day Maine. It has been a voyage of 120 years, and over that period, we have been challenged and transformed. Yet in times of change, the Torah and our tradition have been constant guiding lights for our community. A wise rabbi once said, "We Jews do not live in the past, we live with the past." Our history is part of our identity, and it shapes our future as a community. And so it is that at Congregation Beth Israel, in the year 2008, we proudly carry on the tradition of our ancestors and the legacy of the founders of this synagogue into a new era.